Okay, cool. Okay, so oh wait, let me get this set up. There we go. Wonderful. So originally I was going to do politics and courts. I ended up downsizing a bit, and I'll be doing a brief section on courts next week. I'll be doing mostly just politics tonight. So I'm sort of breaking this into four-ish parts. Really, three will dominate most of this. The first section, I'll chat a bit about electoral volatility worldwide, especially in developing countries. Then I'll talk a bit, actually quite extensively, about the 2024 elections in the US and a bit on Trump's second term and what that will likely look like based on his cabinet picks. Then I'll chat a bit about European politics and their contemporary state. And then lastly, I'll talk a bit about selectorate theory, aka how to be an effective dictator, and sort of misconceptions about authoritarianism and how dictators slash autocrats hold on to power. A couple of quick caveats. The first sort of caveat for this is just I'm not an expert. Obviously, I'll be giving a lot of data in this presentation relative to the last presentation. You should probably not assume the things I say are true, absent secondary justification. So all of this, of course, should be taken with some level of grains of salt, so to speak. Secondly, this lecture will be less debate oriented than a different video I made on politics about 2 years ago, which is much more focused on specific debates about court structure, electoral systems, the ways that campaigns work, and so forth. I'll link that video somewhere so that if you want to access it, you can. But this will be more broadly about kind of broad political issues that tend to come up in debate, as opposed to very specific definitional matters of like what does it mean to have a first past the post voting system, or what is the difference between civil and criminal law, etc. Third, I'm not going to touch geopolitics directly in this. I'll talk about that pretty extensively in the future. Same thing with politics of social movements. Like incidentally, discussions of leftist progressive movements like feminism, queer rights, etc., will come up, but they won't be the focal point of this presentation from a political perspective. Lastly, this presentation kind of oscillates pretty considerably between left and right-wing political views. I've tried to make this reasonably balanced, but there's a decent chance that something in this presentation will not align with your personal view of the world. This is totally reasonable. It's useful to sort of have an exposure to data-driven politics, even if it doesn't necessarily align with the specific way that you happen to view the world. I don't mean you specifically, by the way. I just mean kind of like you in a general sense. So we can get cracking and jump in. So first things first, a couple of trends in politics globally that are worth noting. And perhaps the most interesting trend about 2024 and perhaps the post-COVID political landscape more broadly is incumbency advantage at the federal level appears to be somewhat on the decline. So this is a somewhat widely circulated graph from the Financial Times that's been sort of making its way around social media. And the gist of what this graph demonstrates is that in a selection of developed countries, this is not worldwide entirely, it's just developed countries. But since the Second World War, there's always been at least one incumbent party in a developed country that gained vote share relative to its performance in the previous election. That has not happened in 2024, at least as of November 2024. I actually don't know if there are any potential cases where this will change in December, but none that at least I'm aware of. I suppose if something miraculous happens and France manages to hold an election in a week, which seems completely implausible. Actually, I lied. They're constitutionally prohibited from holding elections until I think it's June 2025, so that won't even hold. But the point is, 2024 has been an unusual election with a significant level of political retaliation against ruling parties in developed countries. And if you just think about what that looks like in practice, Harris, of course, losing to Trump, the conservatives getting absolutely smacked in the July elections in Britain. France, the sort of ruling centrist coalition, crumbling, being in the European Parliament elections in June, forcing Macron to declare snap elections. Although the far right was held out of government via the Couronne Sanitaire the following month, the government that arose was fairly short-lived, a handful of days ago, as of the time of this recording. The center-right government was ousted in France after a vote of no confidence backed by both the far left and the far right, putting Macron and the Ensemble party he leads in a rather difficult position. But it's also true outside of Europe. So the BJP in India was widely expected to have a dominating performance. The BJP's stated goal heading into the April to June elections in India was to win 400 seats in the national parliament. They ended up winning well less actually than they'd won even in the 2019 and 2014 general elections in India, and are now forced to rely on their coalition partners to have a majority in the lower house of parliament. The LDP in Japan has functionally dominated Japanese politics since the end of the Second World War. They've only had two major electoral defeats in that time period, both of them on the waves of major economic crises in the lost decade of the 90s and then stagflation after that. The LDP had a stunning electoral mishap more recently. Fumio Kishida, who's pictured here, had stepped down from the party's ticket, but the party suffered a significant reduction in political support in the recent Japanese elections. In South Africa, the ruling African National Congress Party, which has dominated South African politics since the end of apartheid in 1994, suffered a significant reduction in political support relative to where it had fared in the 2019 election. This is Ramaphosa here, the president of South Africa, whose party has suffered a significant loss of support due to high levels of crime, corruption, inflation, so much so that Zuma, the former president of South Africa, Jacob Zuma, and himself a member of the ANC previously, actually switched party allegiances to back an upstart party that sought to challenge the ANC. In Venezuela, although Maduro in the July 28, 2024 elections notionally claims to have won and has since maintained power, the vast majority of independent third-party polls suggest that he probably lost by a ratio of 2-1, if not maybe even 3-1. In Sri Lanka, after a period of significant political volatility, after the 2022 economic crisis, just elected a communist president. The JVP is a communist, or at least a Marxist-Leninist party with militant background during the Civil War period in Sri Lanka. They now have a majority, almost a supermajority, in fact, in the National Congress, and they also control the presidency. The Awami League in Bangladesh ousted in the August 2024 protests. Here's Sheikh Hasina, who had formerly led the party. She was forced into exile after student protests over the post-1971 Liberation War employment benefit system for descendants of the revolution were protested. Those protests in turn metastasized into a broader protest of AL rule, which has been in power since I think it's 2009, if my memory serves me correctly, although probably fact check me on that. Subsequently resulting in a temporary interim unity government led by Yunus, the technocratic banker and former Nobel Prize winning laureate who pioneered the use of microfinance and microloans. Although this one hasn't gotten as much coverage, in Botswana, the BDP has been the ruling party since the 1960s. They just lost for the first time ever, a pretty remarkable political result if you conceptualize of what it means for one of the longest ruling parties in the entire world to lose its hold on power. Iran elected a relatively moderate president, sort of surprising outside observers who had expected, to at least some extent, that the hardline candidate backed by the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps to potentially win was elected in July. And broadly speaking, this has been a rough year if you're an incumbent political party in a country that has functional elections. And there's lots of potential reasons why, but the simplest is just that inflation has battered incumbent parties, and the economic instability that has followed the pandemic has done a real lot of damage to political establishments and previously dominant political parties, including the BDP in Botswana, the LDP, Japan, the ANC, South Africa, etc. And if you just think conceptually about levels of inflation and their correlation with anti-incumbent voting, the correlation is pretty strong. If you just look, for example, here in Europe, if you consider aggregate waves of both inflation and also immigration, which I'll chat about later, its political consequences for ruling slash incumbent parties, the combination of geopolitical instability, for example, the war in Ukraine, with high levels of immigration, high levels of inflation, high levels of youth unemployment in particular, has created a real nasty set of political and economic conditions that do not do much good if you're a party that's trying to win an election while you are in power. Inflation and interest rates also, of course, happen to be interrelated. So you can sort of see here visually, it's a little bit of an ugly graph, but you can sort of get a visual sense for just how bad the inflation crisis has been, such that central banks across a whole range of countries, not just Europe, but also Asia, Latin America, Africa, etc., have been forced to adjust interest rates accordingly to contain the inflationary spirals that followed COVID, supply chain dislocations, the Russia-Ukraine war and its effect on oil prices, and so forth. And while that's not been universal, for example, inflation has fallen rather remarkably under Javier Milei in Argentina, the consequence has very much been that electoral volatility is on the rise, i.e., people's party affiliations are weaker than they have been in the past, and voters are increasingly willing to give the boot to ruling, even dominant parties in cases where those parties are perceived as mismanaging, in particular, the economy. So if you just look, for example, here, this is a result from British politics. The level of party affiliation, i.e., voters voting for the same party election after election after election, has dropped. This graph here represents the share of voters who switch parties between different elections. So maybe one election you vote Labour, the next you vote Conservative. The share has spiked considerably, even though this graph only goes up to 2017. The trend has continued since then. Trust in institutions relatedly has fallen. If you just look, for example, at the European Union, aggregate levels of trust in institutions like the ECB and the European Parliament and the European Court of Human Rights have all dropped considerably across most countries and across most institutions. And if you even just ask the question, what has happened to conventional mainstream center left and center right parties in many countries in the last 10, 15 years, the answer has often been the near complete decimation of those parties. So the center-left Socialist Party or PASOK Party in Greece, for example, had historically fared quite well alongside New Democracy, the other center-right party in Greece throughout the 80s, 90s, and then early 2000s. And if you compare that to their recent electoral results, they've taken an absolute battering. They usually, historically, had been a party that got somewhere around 50 to 60% of the vote. In a bad year, maybe 40. Now they're down to a position where they're lucky if they even get 10% of the vote. If you look at the Socialist Party in France, historically the bedrock of the center left in France, a similar story appears. 1990s, early and mid 2000s, similar level of electoral success. More recently, they've suffered real heavy losses, particularly in 2022 when they were absolutely decimated. And although they made a slight rebound in 2024, the story still very much remains broadly the same. And as we'll talk about later, there's been a real surge in support for anti-establishment, anti-elite parties, much to be explored there. So that's kind of like the first broad trend just to be aware of. And it also sets the ground nicely for the discussion of what happened in the US election in November. But the broad context is there is rising levels of political instability across nearly every political ecosystem imaginable. This is not just confined to Western Europe, not just confined to Latin America, not just confined to the United States. It's not even just confined to established democracies or nascent democracies or illiberal democracies. This is a trend that applies to a range of countries across the world and kind of an interesting illustration of where economic hardship intersects with political volatility. So, second thing we'll chat about, this will take a significantly longer proportion of the lecture, so buckle in because we've got a lot to get through. We're going to chat a bit about the US election and how to sort of explain the results and trends that we saw in November. So, just to cut to the chase, in case you have been living under a rock and have not already heard, Donald Trump won the presidency with a rather sweeping electoral performance, winning all 7 swing states against Kamala Harris, who did not win a single swing state. So, two quick notes I just want to flag before delving into the sort of explanations for why Trump won and Harris lost. First explanation is most of the things that are said on social media about the election are either misleading or highly inaccurate. So broadly, it's better to use a data-driven approach to thinking about the 2024 election as opposed to people's knee-jerk emotional reactions, both on the left and on the right. Second general caveat is people often ask slightly incorrect questions, in my view, when talking about the 2024 election. So the question that people often ask is, why did Trump win and Harris lose? But what they're really asking is, why did Trump win in 2024 but lose in 2020, etc. So there's really two separate questions you should ask because they have similar but different answers in many ways. The first question is, why did Donald Trump win the 2024 US presidential election? This is not contentious. The answer is inflation, broadly. If you look at swing states, the vast majority of voters, somewhere around 35 to 40% of swing state voters, said that the economy was their top issue. the incumbent, i.e. Harris, was not trusted on the economy. Harris is the vice president. Trump is an outsider who promised to change the economic conditions that have caused prices to increase, and voters punished Harris for being an incumbent in a high inflationary environment. So if you're asking the question, why did Trump win in 2024, there actually is a pretty compelling and pretty direct answer. And the answer is probably just inflation. The question that's much more interesting to ask is Trump has now run in three elections. He ran in 2016 against Clinton, 2020 against Biden, 24 against Harris. And his performance in 24 is notably stronger than his performance in 2020 and in 2016. And so the much more interesting question to ask is not why did Trump win in 2024? We broadly have an answer for that. The more interesting question is how do we explain changes in electoral behavior in the last 4 to 8 years? And what does that tell us about the state of the Democratic and Republican parties? So that's the question that'll be much more interesting to explore, and that's the question I'm going to delve into now. So what does the data say vis-a-vis Trump's performance in 2020 versus 2024, and to some extent 2016 versus 2024? The short answer is that in 2024, the US political system swung markedly towards Trump. On average, there was around a 2 percentage point shift in a significant majority of American counties towards the Republicans. This does not mean that there was a landslide victory for Trump, as many Republicans have claimed. Trump has not cleared 50% of the popular vote, although he did win the popular vote relative to Harris. And although he did win all 7 swing states, the margins in several of those swing states were in fact relatively close. So although the election was a significantly stronger performance for Trump than for Harris, as evidenced by the fact Trump won, it shouldn't be interpreted as a complete decimation of the Democratic Party, although we will have a lot to say about why the Democratic Party fared so poorly. The much more important takeaway, though, is not the fact that in general the US shifted towards the Republicans. The more important takeaway is that specific demographics that historically were strong bases of support for the Democratic Party shifted towards the Republicans. Quick note. A error that is common when looking at data about the 2024 election is just to look at the percentage of people within a certain demographic who voted Harris versus Trump and then make conclusions from that. That's not super useful. For example, you might say, well, Trump won with XYZ group, therefore this group is pro-Trump, or Harris won with this group, therefore this group is pro-Harris. That is true, kind of definitionally, but the much more interesting question is how demographics and their political support have changed in the last 4 to 8 years. So in other words, a commonly cited statistic is like, well, Trump won the white women vote. True, but he also won it in 2016, for example. And it's not particularly useful to ask questions like, well, did Trump win the white women vote? What matters more is how did white women's voting behaviors change between 2016 and 2020? And so those are the questions that are much more interesting to ask. So when you ask that question, what does the data actually say? The first and most important shift is in race. So historically, two major bases of support for the Democratic Party have been Hispanic and especially Black voters. And both of those demographics on balance swung towards Trump. This does not mean that Trump won them. For example, a majority of Hispanic voters still voted for the Democrats, but the margin of victory for the Democrats under Harris was markedly lower than the margin of victory for the Democrats under Biden. So, for example, Hispanic voters swung, depending on which exit polls you look at, around 25 to 30 points to the Republicans, Black voters by somewhere between 10 to 15, maybe at most 20-ish percentage points towards the Republicans. The other interesting factor that's shifted is education. I'm going to save the full discussion of this because I have a whole set of slides related to education in a bit, so I'll pause on exploring that for a moment. But the other interesting shift that's worth noting is in young voters. So a common misconception in debates, or at least an argument that gets made a lot in debate, but is not necessarily as empirically strong as people might think, is young voters are often argued to be significantly more socially and economically progressive than older voters. Hence, they must form the backbone of support for liberal democratic slash social democratic slash left-leaning parties. Empirically, this is somewhat true, but young voters actually swung significantly towards Trump in this election. In fact, depending on exactly which exit polls you look at, young women even swung towards Trump relative to young women's support for Biden in 2020. And that's important because it challenges a lot of the conventional wisdom that young voters are progressive and old voters are conservative. And outside of the US, this context is particularly true. So, for example, some of the strongest base of support for the Romanian far right in the recent presidential and parliamentary elections in Romania has actually not been older voters, it's been younger voters. In fact, the far right Romanian presidential candidate has almost entirely campaigned on TikTok with a very explicit aim towards courting the youth vote. So it's not entirely true that young voters are left leaning, old voters are right leaning. The evidence is a bit more controversial on that. The other just worthwhile note is just demonstrating how many demographics shifted towards Trump. So this here is a little hard to read on the slides, but broadly, almost every demographic or demographic subset of American voters shifted relative to 2020 towards Trump. There are a handful of exceptions, and ironically, they're not the group you might expect. The biggest group that swung towards the Democrats were actually white college-educated men, which runs a bit contrary to the sort of widely cited claims on social media about this being a win handed to Trump by men as opposed to by women. The data is a little bit more contentious on that front. But the point broadly is that demographically, the Democrats suffered, not just in terms of losing a total number of votes, but more importantly, they lost important bases of support that have historically swung towards the Democrats. For example, Harris campaigned very explicitly on abortion as a major issue in her campaign, the goal being to court young women's votes and mobilize the youth female vote. And of course, she did win the young women's vote. But if you compare women's support for Biden, which was around 15 points higher than Trump, compared to Harris, Harris actually underperformed significantly amongst female voters relative to relative to how Biden did in 2020. And that's a problem, of course, because if the Democrats' path to victory was contingent in large part on mobilizing support amongst women, and that did not succeed, it's not exactly surprising the Democrats ended up losing the election. The other point that's worth emphasizing, and I'll circle back to this a bit more in depth later, is that Democrats didn't just lose the swing states, they also suffered some major beatdowns in historically strong left-leaning states. So, for example, states like California, New Jersey, and New York all swung towards Trump. And New Jersey in particular is alarming for Democrats because previously this was a state that was extraordinarily reliably blue in the sense that Democrats could reliably expect to win New Jersey by double-digit percentage margins. In the 2024 election, that margin has narrowed significantly to a point where it probably isn't a swing state. This is probably a one-off election in part caused by inflation and voters punishing Harris for a range of reasons. But nonetheless, it is alarming if you're a Democrat that many historically blue states suddenly look a bit more purple. So the data is pretty clear. This was a terrible election if you were the Democrats and a fantastic election if you are Trump and the Republicans. That doesn't answer the question of why Democrats lost support amongst these key demographics. And although inflation is a compelling answer for why Trump won the election nationwide and why he won the popular vote, it's not a sufficiently compelling explanation for why Democrats lost amongst key constituencies that have historically voted blue. So, why did Democrats suffer so badly in the 2024 election? So, the most commonly cited explanation, and I'll deal with both the case for and against this explanation, is the claim that the Democrats focused too much on progressive social issues or were perceived as being too focused on progressive social issues, and their support for quote unquote woke or DEI policies reduced support amongst key constituencies. So it is just worth noting that there is some empirical truth to this claim, that the Democrats are perceived, even though, as I'll explain in a bit, Harris probably tried to distance herself from this quite extensively, Democrats are perceived as the party of progressive social issues, i.e., even amongst the Democratic Party's own base, many people identify the social policies and social views of the Democratic Party as the kind of core constitutive building block of the DNC. And the part of the reason for that is that if you look at the people who strongly identify as Democrats in surveys, but also in elections, in activism, in campaigning, etc., the people who strongly identify as Democrat in the sort of post-COVID era are increasingly very progressive on social issues. So this is a bit of a confusing graph from the Financial Times, but what it largely represents is if you subset the electorate to people who strongly identify as Democrat, and then you compare their support for traditionally socially progressive issues like affirmative action or expanding immigration and asylum seeking benefits, the sort of strongly self-identified Democrats are significantly more progressive on these issues than the median American voter, and certainly significantly more far away from the median voter than the strongly self-identified Republicans. And it's also just worth noting, I'll make this brief, but it is just important to flag that lots of the people who now strongly identify as sort of hardcore Democrats and as hardcore quote unquote woke progressives are not necessarily supporting views that are widely popular amongst historically disadvantaged communities. So, for example, if you do very just simple polling on whether or not the police force should be expanded or whether it should be downsized, the group that is by far most supportive of significant defunding of the police are white progressives. But if you compare that level of support to, for example, black voters or Hispanic voters, the answer is actually significantly lower in terms of the level of support. Similar issue arises for immigration. In fact, if you actually compare, for instance, first or second generation Hispanic voters' views on migration to white progressives' views on migration, there's a massive disconnect where in some cases white progressives are 2.5 to 3 times more supportive of liberal migration policies than actual naturalized US citizens in terms of their views on migration. So there's a real disconnect increasingly between the sort of white progressive base of the Democratic Party and the historically disadvantaged communities that previously comprised a significant proportion of support for the Democrats. And there's a couple of reasons why that could be alarming if you're a Democrat. And this doesn't just apply to the 2024 presidential election, it also applies more broadly to the Democrats' strategy moving forward. The first and simply most obvious problem is that the Democrats, whether they like it or not, are perceived as a woke party. Harris tried to move away from that quite explicitly, but it does appear that people believe the Democrats are the socially progressive party, and that's what they stand for, even if they won't say it explicitly. And the strongest evidence of this is to compare the sort of median voter profile for the Democratic and Republican parties in the last sort of 2 to 3 decades. So this is a very confusing chart, I'll confess, but it's really important. What the chart basically demonstrates is the relative share of support that the Democrats and Republicans get across two axes, education and income. And the idea is that historically, for example, Obama in 2008 and 2012, and more importantly, well, not more importantly, just more historically, I guess, Clinton in 1996, historically, the Democrats at their core were a working class party. In other words, the Democrats consistently outperformed Republicans amongst voters who didn't have a college degree and amongst voters who live in lower income communities. That has gradually changed over the last 25 to 30 years. So, for example, if you look at the sort of median voter profile for Clinton in 2016 or Biden in 2020, the shift was towards still low income voters, i.e., Democrats continue to outperform Republicans across a range of low income voters, not necessarily non college educated low income white voters, but certainly, for example, low income black voters, low income Hispanic voters, and so forth. In 2024, the voter profile for Democrats markedly shifted. The Democrats are now the party of highly educated, high income earning voters. That was where the Republicans used to be. So, in other words, Dole, who was the 1996 Republican candidate, that was the base of support for the 1996 Republican Party. It was also the base of support for the Republican Party historically, even prior to that. The Republicans were, in many ways, the party of the wealthy, the well-educated, and so on, and the Democrats were the sort of working class party that focused more on class mobilization. That has shifted. Trump in 2024 is now the candidate who is dominating amongst non-college educated, lower income voters. And that's majorly alarming if you're the Democratic Party, because that historically used to be the base of support for the DNC. And statistically, this is also borne out even more recently in the last two elections. This graph here shows up to 2022, but the trend held into 2024, where the Democrats are actually now losing support amongst the lowest sort of quartile of income and are now gaining support amongst the wealthiest voters. And that's a major problem if the Democrats are trying to win working class voters but no longer have their support. The question, of course, you might then wonder is, well, maybe the Democrats are losing support amongst working class voters, but is it actually related at all to their stances on social issues? Probably the simplest answer is, to some extent, political campaigning is zero sum. If you spend lots of time talking about issue X, you can't spend as much time talking about issue Y. And that does appear to be true to some extent in contemporary American politics. There are many working class voters who simply feel abandoned by the Democratic Party. So this is Bernie Sanders' argument, for instance, that the Democratic Party has abandoned the working class because it no longer talks about the working class, or it doesn't talk about issues like global capitalism, the welfare state, redistribution, and so forth, to the extent that is necessary to gain the support of working class voters. The sort of second potential reason why the Democrats focus on social issues in the last 5 to 10 years is risky is that progressive social messaging is not necessarily popular amongst non-progressive, or more importantly, non-white voter blocks. So, for example, Latino voters and Hispanic voters more broadly were some of the sharpest to shift towards Trump in the 2024 election. And of course, that's interesting because many analysts had wondered, pretty reasonably, if Trump's fairly harsh rhetoric on race and on immigration in particular would potentially undermine the Republicans' chances of winning voters, for example, in Hispanic communities or Latino voters. It turns out to be the opposite. Trump massively overperformed Democrats with respect to Latino voters, where every sub-demographic, for example, Latino women, Latino men, people who live in urban areas or suburban communities or in rural towns, all shifted towards Trump relative to 2020. And that is, of course, not confined just to Latino voters. So, for example, if you look at working class boroughs in New York City, which are, with the exception of Staten Island, which is significantly majority white, if you look at the other suburbs, which have substantial numbers of immigrants living in those areas, naturalized citizens, individuals who are Black, who are Hispanic, who are Asian, those boroughs all shifted pretty markedly towards Trump, especially not just compared to 2020, but even compared to 2016, and even compared to Romney back in 2012. And that is, again, alarming if you're a Democratic Party strategist, because it appears that social messaging does not appear to be resonating adequately with the minority communities that the Democratic Party has historically focused on. The third issue is progressive social messaging doesn't necessarily guarantee Democratic votes, even in previously Democratic strongholds. So, as I alluded to earlier, if you look at the states that swung the most heavily towards Trump, the states that swung the most heavily towards Trump are, in order, New York, New Jersey, Florida, California, Massachusetts, Texas, Rhode Island. Now, of course, Texas and Florida have previously voted Republican in the last two presidential elections. And so if you're a Democratic strategist, you probably now can confidently say, okay, all those crazy polls that showed Democrats being in striking range in Texas or even in Florida, those are certainly not viable states anymore. But if you're a Democrat, you should be far more alarmed at states like New York or Massachusetts that have historically been extraordinarily supportive of Democrats. And of course, they still will be. No one seriously thinks California is turning red in 2028. But the fact that you've lost up to 10 or even, 12 percentage points worth of voters is deeply troubling and suggests that Democrats do need to focus more on economic issues because they can't win solely on issues like abortion rights or protecting democracy. The last thing that's just worth flagging, and this is something that I'll circle back to in a bit, is one of the big arguments that was made by the Harris campaign throughout the election season was that Trump massively fucked up, in essence. The argument was that Trump left office with a disastrously high unemployment rate, with January 6th, with high levels of economic instability, and so forth. The problem is that if you actually look at polling, most people agree 2020 was a bad year. It's a little odd that Trump would repeatedly say things like, "Are you better today than you were 4 years ago?" And the answer he was seemingly trying to get people to say was, "I was better 4 years ago." And lots of people pretty reasonably questioned whether that was an effective strategy because 4 years ago, the United States had thousands of people dying every day from COVID and millions of people unemployed. But the Democrats were largely ineffective in weaponizing the pains of 2020. And part of the reason why is that two of the big sort of most memorable events of 2020 for most American voters are interestingly, and this isn't like my view, this is just what polling data suggests, are largely blamed on Democrats, not on Republicans. So the two big things that voters remember from 2020 broadly are A, COVID, and B, the Black Lives Matter protests that emerged post George Floyd in May 2020. What's curious is that many voters remember Democrats, for example, Democratic leaning teachers unions, as being the primary instigator of lockdowns and prolonged lockdowns in particular. And of course, many associate Democrats with the BLM protests of 2020. And so, for a significant number of voters, the Democratic argument from Harris that Trump's 2020 performance was disastrous evidently didn't land because it's not clear that voters punished Trump for the pandemic in the way that Harris was punished for inflation. Of course, this is, if you're the Harris administration, no doubt deeply frustrating because Biden arguably was powerless in many ways to stop inflation. Lots of it had to deal with supply chain dislocations that had nothing to do with fiscal stimulus, and it was arguably beyond his control, given that inflation rates have surged across the world, including in countries that didn't have large stimulus packages. But it seems that voters didn't show Biden and now Harris the same level of sort of exemption from blame that they showed Trump with respect to COVID. So that's the case for why the Democrats' perception as a socially progressive party potentially hurt them in 2024 and more broadly is hurting them politically. You should be skeptical of this argument, though, because Harris explicitly distanced herself quite dramatically from the far left progressive faction of the Democratic Party. Perhaps most obviously, Harris was very adamant about not talking about identity politics in her campaign. So, for example, you might remember this early on in the campaign, in fact, just a handful of weeks into her campaign being announced, Harris did her first sit down interview. And one of the first questions she was asked was about what it meant to be, like a black woman running. And she was subsequently asked if she had a response to Trump's comments that Harris wasn't really black. And Harris just refused to answer the question. She was basically said, next question. And the reason she did that, even though she probably could have gone into a significantly more prolonged explanation of what it means to be a black woman running for office in 2024 in the United States. Part of the reason she probably didn't do that is to explicitly reject the claim that she is a woke candidate campaigning on primarily social issues. Even outside of that, Harris was unusually anti-leftist in her campaigning. So, for example, Harris's views on immigration could plausibly be construed as reasonably Republican. For example, if you compare even Clinton's stance on the border in 2016 to Harris's stance, Harris in 2024 is much closer to Trump in 2016 than Clinton, sorry, in 2016. Similarly, Harris was quite anti-leftist on many other issues. For example, Harris could plausibly have caved to the pro-Palestinian flank of the Democratic Party, for example, in focusing on gaining votes, say, in Dearborn, Michigan, but ended up backing continued arms sales to Israel, much, of course, to the outrage of the progressive faction of the Democratic Party. The point is not that Harris was not a socially progressive candidate. Of course, abortion was a huge component of her advocacy, and her attacks on Project 2025 often had a social lens to them. But you should be skeptical of the claim that Harris lost the election because she was too woke. You would have to also believe that voters did not believe Harris's campaigning that she was not nowhere near as leftist as the Republicans tried to portray her as being. So that's one potential explanation for why Harris fared so poorly in the election, which is just that she was punished by voters who are frustrated with sort of woke leftist ideology and found comfort in Trump sort of speaking truth to power. The, I think, stronger explanation actually has to do with education. And I sort of flagged this earlier, the shift from the Democratic Party being the party of the relatively non-college educated working class to the party of the elite progressive, college-educated selectorate of the political electorate. But it's just worth emphasizing how sharp the college slash diploma divide is in the United States. So the increasing divide in American politics actually is not race or class. The increasing divide in with respect to who you vote for does appear to be whether you are university educated or high school educated. Um, and this also extends beyond education to political engagement. So, in general, more politically engaged people are statistically more likely to be pro-Democrat. Statistically less politically engaged people appear to be more pro-Republican. Obviously, there's a bit of a correlation here. It's probably not causal, i.e., it's plausible that the subset of people who are more interested in politics support Democrats for reasons independent of the fact they consume more news. But that trend is very much present and concerning for the Democrats because you don't win elections by just appealing towards progressives who are university educated. You inevitably need to win, for example, in rural areas, or at least limit the margin of loss in rural areas. And you need to gain the support of people in deindustrialized areas. Think Ohio. You need to get the support of people who do not have university diplomas and do not support fairly far left social stances. The next related issue, and this kind of segues nicely from the discussion of the Democrats losing the support of working class voters, is the Democrats arguably struggled in 2024 on the presidential ticket because they had terrible economic messaging. So the problem since day one of the campaign for Biden was always inflation. Voters hate inflation. It affects nearly all voters, and uh, it is a incumbent killer. And the problem for Biden and Harris is that they never really had a particularly compelling answer on this. So I'll sort of walk through the different ways that Biden, and then once he stepped down, Harris attempted to answer the question of inflation. So one strategy that Democrats pursued very briefly, this was many months ago, they abandoned it quite a while ago, is Democratic strategists and left-leaning media outlets, MSNBC, for example, would sometimes just make the argument that the American economy was actually doing great. And of course, they are kind of empirically correct on this. If you compare recovery rates in, say, the United States versus most of Western Europe or most other developed countries for that matter, even Japan, the US economy has dramatically outperformed many other developed countries in terms of growth rates, in terms of productivity, in terms of value-added industries as a percentage of GDP. The problem is that it's a really terrible political argument to tell people that the economy is doing great when they don't think the economy is doing great, or more specifically, when they're outraged by inflation. So that strategy was never destined to work. And credit where credit is due, Harris and Biden did drop this argument, but it still demonstrates a lack of political capacity that that argument was ever even broached. The next strategy the Democrats tried, not necessarily sequentially, but certainly was employed at parts, including in the first presidential debate, the disastrous debate with Biden versus Trump. The other argument Democrats made is that even though inflation is bad in the US, it's worse elsewhere. So basically, you should take what you have because it could be a lot worse. Again, similar problem here. It's true. Inflation has been worse in other countries compared to the United States, but that doesn't mean that inflation hurts people's wallets and pocketbooks any less. The fact that you would be doing worse if you lived in, I don't know, Germany doesn't mean that you should be happy about what Biden and Harris did in the United States. So those are the kind of bad messages that Democrats largely abandoned in the run-up to the election, but it still did leave a sour taste in many American voters' mouth that those arguments were made. The more compelling arguments basically came down to three to kind of four things. One was the Democratic argument that inflation is coming down, and this is an argument that Harris made repeatedly and Harris surrogates made repeatedly, which is inflation used to be as high as 9% or 11%, depending on which is your preferred inflation metric. But the point is, inflation has since come down. It's probably around 2.8 to probably 3% now in the United States as of December 2024. The problem with this is it misunderstands the political implications of inflation. The reason inflation is important is because voters hate the fact that prices are higher. And even if wage growth outpaces inflation, and in some areas and in some parts of the country that has been true, inflation still hurts because the perception that your wage increases are being eaten up by higher prices is deeply frustrating to many voters. So the problem with saying inflation is coming down is that that doesn't mean that the economy is deflating. It just means that prices are not increasing by as much as they used to be increasing. So even if you say inflation is only now 3%, where it used to be 6%, that doesn't answer voters' underlying grievances, which is that something that used to cost $2 now costs 4.50, and that is economically painful. Of course, this is where Trump benefited from sort of being able to make a series of arguments that are completely empirically implausible. For example, Trump has suggested or made arguments that prices will come down under his presidency. This is deranged empirically because at most Trump could theoretically bring inflation below 2%, but there are very few people who seriously think that Trump's presidency would somehow cause a basket of goods that currently costs $12 to suddenly cost less than that. The last two arguments that Democrats made were Trump would have been worse if he had been in the presidency in the last 4 years. Again, similar problems as the previous counterfactual claims. The better argument they made is that Trump's presidency will cause inflation to become a lot worse. And of course, empirically, this is kind of broadly true. I'll sort of link a set of notes I've written on this, but there's a basket of reasons to believe that Trump's presidency probably will be reasonably inflationary. For example, mass deportations are pretty likely to end up having inflationary consequences. And more broadly, protectionism is likely to increase inflation across the board. And all of that means that probably is true that if voters are worried about inflation, then Trump is is the comparatively worst pick for inflation. The problem with this argument is not that it's wrong empirically. The problem is that it doesn't sell politically. And the simple reason why is because the argument that the other guy is going to be worse is a hard argument to sell as an incumbent. Because Trump, as the anti-establishment candidate, i.e., as the non-incumbent candidate, just had to convince American voters that the status quo was bad and he would do something to change it. The problem is that when voters want change, the nature of that change is often less important than the existence of a promise for change. So, in other words, lots of economic crises beget populist leaders entering into politics and winning elections. It's not because voters rationally appraise the economic policies proposed by populists as net deflationary. It's more that if you are dissatisfied with the current administration, you don't want to put that administration back in power because you've lost faith in their ability to execute effective public policy. And so the reason that the Harris argument that Trump's agenda will be inflationary didn't seem to click is because it didn't matter if you're a voter who's frustrated with inflation. If you don't trust Harris, you're willing to take the bet that maybe Trump's presidency will be better because he represents change. He is the outside force. He is not the establishment. The last argument that Harris focused on more so than Biden is a series of reasons why the Harris administration would be good economically. So a series of proposals on housing reform, on bringing down the cost of prescription drugs, on increasing access to childcare, so on and so forth. There were two reasons this argument ended up not winning a sufficient number of voters to the Harris camp. One of them is a decent number of voters probably were persuaded, at least to some extent, by the Trump argument that if all of these things were good, why haven't you done them already? And that's a little bit of a reductionist argument, but the underlying premise is not unreasonable, which is many people were frustrated by the Biden-Harris administration's handling of the economy. It's hard to believe Harris is going to fundamentally change things, given that she explicitly supported Biden and the record that the Harris-Biden administration had. And the problem then becomes if you're Harris and you're trying to sell Americans on your vision for the economy, but you're also unwilling to distance yourself from Biden, it's very hard to convince people that your presidency is going to be meaningfully economically better than the Biden presidency if you're not willing to publicly oppose or at least criticize the Biden record. The second reason this strategy didn't work adequately, And this argument is more contentious, but it's worth flagging. There are lots of people who just don't think that Harris sold her agenda well. And part of the reason she didn't sell it well is because no one really knew exactly what Harris stood for. One of the main criticisms of the Harris campaign is that it never had a very clear message, or even when it did have a clear message, the message changed too radically over time. So, in essence, Harris's kind of campaign message ended up being Trump is a threat to democracy. A Harris presidency will reduce inflation and bring stability and respect to the American nation, both domestically and internationally. And Trump is a unfit to be president type candidate. The problem is that Harris actually spent relatively little time nailing out the explicit mechanisms through which her presidency would reduce things like inflation or reduce the cost of having children. It's not to say she didn't have policies, she did. It's just that the Harris administration never focused enough on those. And where they did focus on her economic proposals was in paid media. So, for example, the Democrats pretty quickly realized under Harris that the most effective political messages to run through ads were focused on inflation and the cost of living crisis. But lots of the free media that Democrats had, so interviews they had with major news broadcasters or Harris going on podcasts or Harris surrogates giving interviews, lots of that free media was not spent talking about Harris's economic agenda. It was spent talking about her political agenda, more specifically with respect to Trump being a threat to democracy. The consequence is, although Harris did have an economic agenda that probably would have reduced inflation significantly more than Trump, that agenda was not adequately whipped by the Harris campaign. And as such, voters were either unaware of the agenda, mistrusting of the agenda, or simply dissatisfied with Harris's campaign. The other reason that the Democrats struggled so consistently, not only under the Harris campaign, but also under the Biden campaign with respect to inflation, is that the Democrats never really developed an effective tactic of scapegoating. So Trump is in many ways a deranged candidate. And I don't say that in a insulting way, I mean it in an objective way, in the sense that lots of Trump's proposed policies will definitely be inflationary. For example, tariffs are almost by definition an inflationary measure. That's the point of doing a tariff, at least in the short term. But the reason that Trump was nonetheless trusted more on the economy, and empirically polls back this up, is because Trump was significantly better at scapegoating than Harris. And what I mean by scapegoating is externalizing blame for economic problems. If you listen to Trump, Trump paints a kind of crazy but also clear picture for why the American economy is struggling. And the short answer is that the United States is being flooded by millions of illegal immigrants who are stealing our jobs and taking welfare benefits, and the United States is being outcompeted and undercut by China. And the argument from Trump is, I will use a position of strength to reduce immigration and to give us a fair deal with China. Now, the actual empirics on this are contestable. The China claim, very fair. The claim on migration, significantly less so. And any arguments on transgender people's effect on the economy are just fully non-empirical. But the benefit that the Trump campaign had was it had a clear narrative. It had a clear enemy for people to latch their hatred onto. And Trump could paint himself as the sort of force that would bring balance and would attack the forces responsible for the gradual deterioration of Americans' sense of security in their economic affairs. Harris did not have that to nearly the same extent. The scapegoat that Harris continually turned to was Trump as the scapegoat, i.e., the reason that we have such high levels of or such high levels of political polarization is because of Trump. The reason why we have January 6th is because of Trump. And all of that is fair to a significant degree. But the Biden-Harris campaigns were less effective at convincing Americans that there was a powerful enemy they could blame for inflation. And just to be clear, like they did try to do this to some extent. So for example, Biden would frequently blame Putin and the war in Russia for high gas and oil prices and for driving up global commodity price levels. The problem is that the Democrats didn't push this type of messaging far enough. For example, Democrats didn't do something like drag the CEOs of major grocery stores into Congress to grill them on price gouging accusations. Even if that's bullshit, they could have done it for political gain, but didn't do so to nearly the extent required to get national airtime. And the consequence is that Harris was in a very uncomfortable position. She is the vice president in a deeply unpopular administration at a moment of intense economic uncertainty and insecurity for tens, if not hundreds of millions of American voters. And she didn't have a compelling explanation for why voters should have faith in her to have an effective term in office. She had excellent arguments, and for many voters, persuasive arguments for why Trump was in many ways the significantly worse candidate. But the fact that you can bash Trump is not a reason to believe you should trust Harris. And given that Democrats have arguably exhausted their sort of anti-MAGA, anti-Trump rhetoric, both in 2016 and then again in 2020, it's implausible that Democrats could have ever won by playing that hand. The last explanation I want to talk about for why Democrats struggled so significantly in 2024 is, was Harris just a weak candidate? And there are sort of four arguments that people make here. But before I explain them, I just want to briefly frame how you should think about this question. Whenever people ask, was Harris a uniquely weak candidate? The question that you should be asking in order to answer that is, in a counterfactual world where a different candidate was run under different or identical circumstances, would the result of the election have been different? So, for example, a common argument that's made for why Harris lost is that Harris lost due to racism and sexism in the American electorate. There is obviously truth to the claim that there are many sexist and racist voters in the United States who did not vote for Harris, in part because, or in whole, because of their racist and sexist views. But that doesn't justify the conclusion that Harris lost the election due to racism and sexism. The question you really should be asking is, hypothetically, in a different world where the Democrats ran a white male non-Biden candidate, think Gavin Newsom, would the result have been different? And it's difficult to envision that being the tipping point. It's possible, it's entirely feasible that Harris lost the election solely on the basis of identity politics and discrimination against Black women, but it's not entirely clear that data supports that claim. There are voters who are so racist and sexist they would never vote for a Black woman. It's not clear that those voters would alternatively have voted Democrat, or enough of them would have voted Democrat or not voted Trump to swing the result of the election. And given that Harris polled historically poorly with many non-white voters and even with women relative to Biden back in 2020 or Clinton in 2016, there's a lot of empirical questions around the extent to which Harris was a weak candidate on the basis of her identity. There are much stronger arguments, though, for why Harris may have been a weak candidate. One of them is not an attack on Harris, it's an attack on Biden. And the claim that's made is Harris lost the election because she came into the race too late. She only had 107 days to campaign. That was never enough time. This argument is very intuitive at first glance. It's actually much more empirically complicated if you think about this. So, the most obvious reason it's empirically complicated is that plenty of countries have snap elections, and snap elections work adequately, i.e., plenty of candidates and plenty of parties campaign in well less than 107 days and still convince large numbers of voters to vote for them. That being said, that evidence is suspicious because the norm in American politics is that you have much more than 107 days to campaign for the presidency. That being said, it's not entirely true that most presidents or most presidential candidates have over a year, for example, to focus entirely on campaigning solely for the presidency. So, for example, Barack Obama locked up the Democratic nomination, who you might remember in 2008, he was running in the primaries against Clinton, who nearly toppled him and, in fact, was the presumptive favorite heading into the primaries. But Obama only locked up that nomination on June 3rd, 2008. Harris was given the nomination, I forget the exact date, but it was sort of mid-July 2024. Now, that is a month and a half difference, and that is notable, but it's not entirely clear that the reason Harris lost is because of how short her campaign was, given that there is empirical evidence that candidates can perform quite well. Obama won, remember, in 2008, with a relatively short timetable. The other reason that you should be suspicious of the argument that Harris lost because of the brief campaign is the brief campaign also provided Harris with many benefits. For example, the fact that Harris had a relatively short campaign may have actually facilitated her fundraising efforts. Lots of people donated huge amounts of money to Harris in a relatively short period of time, and that in many ways did give a huge financial boost to Harris that maybe she wouldn't have gotten if there was less of an exigent, urgent need to back the Harris campaign in order to facilitate its rather abrupt beginning. On top of that, the brevity of the Harris campaign maybe was beneficial because it means that Harris got to run an unconventional campaign against an unconventional candidate. For example, in a conventional election, you'd have many more months for all of Harris's previous flaws or comments to be exposed and discussed and debated extensively. The brief nature of her campaign maybe was beneficial because Harris had greater control over narrative surrounding her campaign. This isn't to say that Harris benefited from the briefness of her campaign. It's just to say that it's not clear that the effect of a brief campaign was strictly negative for the Democrats. It's plausible the relationship works the other way. The third potential reason Harris was a uniquely poor candidate is because Harris was just always an unpopular candidate, i.e., even in 2020, Harris polled very poorly in the presidential Democratic primaries, and perhaps Harris was just always destined to lose. The Democrats never should have picked her to begin with, maybe in 2020. And of course, much as like leftists dislike this argument, there is, of course, empirical truth to the claim that Harris was picked as Biden's vice president, in part on the basis of her being a black woman. This is, of course, an argument made repeatedly by Republicans to disparage her. It doesn't, oops, I skipped a slide ahead. It doesn't disparage, it doesn't disregard the legitimate work she's done as vice president, but it also was quite clear that that was the primary motive for Biden picking Harris as opposed to any other potential candidate to be vice president. Now, that being said, I think that this is my personal view, and I'll give some data to back it up, but this argument is probably a bit overblown because it overly relies on polling data prior to July 2024. So it is true that Harris had popularity problems prior to becoming the Democratic nominee, but Harris's favorability ratings actually surged remarkably between July 2024 and November 2024. And although Harris did lose in rather humiliating fashion in the election, the level of improvement her campaign made between its origins and where it ended is actually pretty remarkable, which suggests that maybe Harris was always an unelectable candidate, but it's not necessarily clear that if you simulated this election 100 times over, she was always destined to lose because she was innately unlikable. The more compelling explanation for why Harris was unelectable is because she was the vice president in an unpopular administration she was not willing to distance herself from. And in that context, it's not unreasonable to say, yeah, she was going to lose more often than she was going to win if you simulated this election repeatedly. The last potential reason Harris was a weak candidate is not because of anything specific to Harris, but because of her vice presidential pick. Many people have criticized, myself included, have criticized the Waltz pick. That being said, this argument was made, including by me, by people who assumed that Pennsylvania would be the decisive state that Harris needed to win the election. And that's why maybe, for example, she should have picked someone like Shapiro, the Pennsylvania governor, or the senator from Arizona, Mark Kelly. The problem is Harris lost all 7 swing states. It's not at all clear that had she picked a different vice president, things would have gone her way. If she had lost because she lost Pennsylvania, the conversation would be very different, but that's not the conversation we're having. There's an additional argument about why Harris lost that I do want to explore because I think that there is some merit to it. It's not entirely uncontroversial, but it is certainly worth exploring, which is Nate Silver's risk aversion argument for why the Democrats lost. So Nate Silver's sort of, well, not his entire explanation, but a core part of Nate Silver's explanation for why the Democrats lost goes something like this. The Democrats ran a risk-averse campaign in 2024 at every step of the way, and they failed to take adequate risks that would potentially have beaten Trump. So there's 3 examples of this. The last one is the most important, so I'll start there. The perhaps biggest risk that Harris never took, and almost certainly should have taken, is Harris was far too reluctant at any point in time to distance herself from Biden. Now, if you read transcripts of interviews with Harris's campaign staff, so for example, they did an interview with Pod Save America a few weeks after the election where they're asked this question explicitly, the reason that's given for why Harris didn't distance herself from Biden is because she is Biden's vice president, and there is probably a sense of allegiance and loyalty to the White House you work in. I mean, it's not entirely unreasonable. She is the vice president under Biden and has worked to execute the Biden administration's agenda. But Harris probably suffered massively from not adequately opposing Biden's record. Because she publicly linked herself to the Biden White House and stood by the Biden record, she could continually be slaughtered by right-wing arguments that the Biden administration has largely been a failure for Americans and change is needed. And because Harris was unwilling to jettison herself from Biden's policies and Biden's policy record, she was explicitly framed as the pro-establishment, pro-status quo candidate, i.e., if you like the way things are, you should vote for Harris, and if you don't, you should reject her and vote Trump. And because Harris never switched that, it's arguably the case that she was never viably going to overcome the inflation threat because she was never going to convince voters, given her linkage to the Biden administration, that she would do anything differently. And hence, there was a reasonable chance that voters would just view her as more of the same. And if same is bad, then Harris would lose. The second way that Democrats were too risk averse is with respect to Biden. So just to be clear, I'm operating under the, I think, fairly uncontroversial presumption that Biden made the right choice to drop out, but he should never have run for re-election in the first place, and he should have dropped out far earlier. But what's often neglected when people talk about Biden's decision to drop out is it took Biden 3.5 weeks after his horrible debate performance to drop out. And one of the key questions that's been asked, and Nate Silver was one of the first to raise it, as Rick Klein has also poked at this, is in that period in time, 3.5 to 4 weeks after the debate, before Biden's announcement that he was departing from the race, several top Democrats, Pelosi, for example, eventually came out publicly to claim Biden should drop out. It took top Democrats several weeks to make that decision. And even more alarmingly, many top Democrats only ended up turning in support of Harris as the nominee after Biden made his announcement publicly. And what this demonstrates is not necessarily irrational behavior by individual Democrats, i.e., it makes sense if you're an individual Democratic Party staffer or senator or representative or campaign official, it makes sense that you are not going to want to stick your neck out on the line and say Biden should drop out. But collectively, it is deeply alarming that the Democratic Party did not take more risks to force Biden to drop out earlier. So, a simple example, there is pretty credible evidence now that the Biden campaign, soon after the debate, began explicitly funding polling on Harris's favorability ratings and how she would fare in a head-to-head matchup against Trump. As in the days after Biden's debate, the Biden campaign evidently started using funds to investigate the political viability of a non-Biden ticket. Why didn't, just as an intuition pump, the campaign manager for then the Biden campaign, she also then ended up becoming the campaign manager for Harris, why didn't a major campaign official or donor, for example, for Biden go to, say, the Washington Post or the New York Times or any number of major news outlets and make a very simple claim, which is we have the polling data. Biden is an unelectable candidate. He's not mentally fit for office. He has to go. This is the only way that we can prevent Trump from winning the election. The fact that that didn't happen, and the fact that so many Democrats continued to toe the party line even after Biden's debate performance, is again demonstrative of a party that has an insufficient risk appetite. And this also reflects a broader problem with Bayesian reasoning within the Democratic Party, that the Democratic Party is arguably unwilling in many cases to adjust its policy preferences and its viewpoints on important issues in response to new evidence and new data. And perhaps one of the most controversial examples of that is Democrats, even still to this day, are still reluctant to talk about Biden's mental decline in office, even though there is rather considerable evidence that Biden has suffered very significant mental deterioration while in office. The debate is the best evidence of that, but evidence from staffers corroborates that account. The point is that Democrats were not sufficiently risk averse in the aftermath of the debate. And because they weren't risk averse, there was insufficient pressure on Biden to do something to step out of the race earlier. And that may have hurt Harris, especially if you believe this argument that only having 107 days was bad for the Harris campaign. The last example of where the Democrats didn't take risks they probably should have is October 2024. So if you looked at polls throughout October 2024, as I kind of did obsessively, what you would sort of notice is that Harris and Trump were functionally in a dead heat in most swing states, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Georgia, etc. And Of course, much has been made about the accuracy or inaccuracy of polls. Broadly, they were accurate with a slight bias towards Democrats. Polls tended to cluster towards around a 47-48 or 48-48 type split between Harris and Trump, respectively. There are various reasons for that I can get into in a bit, but if you're the Harris campaign, no doubt that's alarming. And part of the reason it's alarming is because Democrats typically, based on the last two electoral cycles, know that they probably need to be outperforming polls by 2 to 3 points to beat Trump, given that there are well documented issues with underrepresenting Trump's true level of support in polls. So Harris's campaign, and they've admitted this publicly since, probably knew that they were either at best in a toss-up or realistically trailing heading into November 2024. But the Harris campaign arguably didn't do enough to try to shake things up in the race more, to try to potentially eke out a narrow lead over Trump. The one thing the Harris campaign did do that was risky, but probably stupidly risky, uh, stupid in the sense that it wasn't borne out by evidence, is late in October, the Harris campaign began to publicly label Trump a fascist after several of his top former aides, including a military general, publicly labeled Trump a fascist. The problem with this strategy is if you look at the internal polling that even the Harris campaign itself was using, the evidence was overwhelming that the arguments about Trump threatening democracy were not salient in convincing swing voters or undecided voters, especially in swing states, to make up their mind. And in fact, those arguments, particularly the claim that Trump is a fascist, may have actually emboldened further support for Trump, especially amongst his base. So the Harris campaign did take a risk in October. They just took a risk that was not smart. It was a risk that had very little payoff and high potential risk of downside when the Democrats could plausibly have played a different angle. For example, one risk you could have taken is maybe take an explicitly more oppositional stance towards Biden on the issue of inflation and see how that plays out with voters. The last claim I'll sort of just make on Harris's campaign is related to the October surprise issue, which is Harris's campaign arguably started remarkably strongly and ended quite weakly. So this is not that this is strong evidence of anything, but this was a text I sent back in late August about being very happy with the state of Harris's campaign right around the days of the Democratic convention in Chicago. But if you compare that to where Harris and Walz ended up, not that my single text is evidence of them starting strong, but there's strong evidence that the Harris campaign had a strong start based on fundraising, based on boosts in poll numbers, based on the success of the convention. Look at where the Harris campaign ended up down the road. And one of the kind of silly examples of this, but also a real example, is about 2 weeks away from the election. This was the front page of the Harris Walz campaign website. And it's just a bit odd that their best message, like the message that they're literally putting at the front of their campaign website, is 14 days left. And the reason I say that's a bit of an odd message is because it's not actually a policy message. It's not a rallying cry. It's not a campaign idea. And this is like literally the front page of the Harris Walz movement. This was the message they were sending. And of course, it makes sense that, there's a practical dimension here. They're trying to get the vote out and get people to mail in ballots. But the point is, the Harris Walz campaign probably did struggle down the road as the election came nearer and nearer. And this is just one piece of evidence where the campaign started very strong but struggled as the election advanced. And part of the further evidence for that is that the Harris campaign became increasingly negative as the election went on. So if you listen to Harris's speeches back in August and even September 2024, the overwhelming message was one of joy. Like even just if you think about the music that Harris would play at rallies, Beyonce, for example, the explicit focus was on positive messaging, a positive vision for the future. We are not going back. The more and more that the campaign went on, and this is admittedly not unusual in campaigns, but it probably wasn't effective in Harris's case, the more and more that the messaging became negative, i.e., attacking Trump on his democracy record, January 6th, Democratic backsliding, fascism, etc. And it's not clear that that strategy was ever going to work effectively with voters, given the major concerns that I raised previously that the Democrats have overplayed their hand with respect to demonizing Trump. There's a kind of like funny way of summarizing this, which is the sort of SNL take on Harris's campaign, which is that while the sort of like vibe of the Harris campaign was always quite good, the actual message, the actual content of the campaign was always a bit in flux. The last thing I want to talk about then with respect to the 2020 election is just explaining why Harris's two major paths to victory ended up failing. So there were realistically two major things that Harris wanted to win the election on. She wanted to win the election on the state of democracy and protecting democracy in the face of the Trumpian slash MAGA threat. And she also wanted to win the election with respect to abortion, mobilizing women to turn out and vote and protect abortion rights after the overturning of Roe v. Wade in June 2022. Neither of these arguments ended up working. So why did the democracy argument not work? Probably the simplest argument is just that the median voter cares more about the cost of gas, eggs, and milk than potential speculative threats to democracy. And this is an interesting example of an epistemic bias in debating, wherein the vast majority of debaters, at least debaters that live in democratic countries, probably have a very strong ingrained pro-democracy bias. Reasonably, we've all made arguments for why democracy is good, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the average person in an actual electoral county has the same level of pro-democracy bias that overcomes frustrations with more immediate output legitimacy oriented economic concerns. So probably the simplest rationalization for why people were willing to vote for Trump is very simply because they cared more about the immediate economic harms they faced than the potential harms that could come from, say, packing of the Supreme Court or undermining of checks and balances, or heck, even a potential coup circa January 6th. There are also arguments that don't require you to believe, though, that voters just don't care about democracy. So I'll go through a couple of them for why Harris was unable to convince voters that democracy was on the line. One of them, as I flagged before, is that Democrats have consistently framed almost every election in this century as being the most important election of our lifetimes and protecting democracy against the sort of fascist far right. And the problem is if you keep on using the argument, it loses its relative power. And the other reason it's problematic is Trump, to many moderate voters' perspectives, doesn't appear as threatening to democracy as Democrats make him seem. And I think that Democrats probably actually are right on this, given Trump's explicit involvement in January 6th and election conspiratorial theory that would have aimed to overturn the 2020 results. The problem is that the average American doesn't view Trump in nearly the same fascist slash neo-authoritarian lens as the average leftist media outlet or leftist podcast host. And so there was a real disconnect between the intensity of rhetoric coming from the political left and the perceived democratic threat from the Trump movement. Additionally, there were lots of people who just genuinely did not view Democrats as reasonably good for democracy either. I'll kind of flag here that the Democrats do have a major problem in the way that they talk about democracy, which is that Democrats frame Trump as a major threat to democracy and then ignore and or rationalize in instances in which Democrats support democratic backsliding. One of the simplest examples of this, although certainly had almost nothing to do with the 2024 election results, is a range of the court reform measures that have been introduced by progressives within the Democratic Party are almost verbatim, not verbatim, that's an exaggeration, but are actually quite similar to many of the court reforms that have been implemented in Hungary and Poland, and which have been widely accused of fomenting democratic backsliding. So many of the democratic sort of outrages with the current Supreme Court are in many ways like thinly veiled assaults on democracy masquerading as protecting the courts from Republican bias, etc. The more tangible example for where Democrats appear highly hypocritical on the issue of democracy is the Trump convictions. The argument that Democrats made is that Trump has broken the law and therefore deserves punishment. This is true. The problem, or at least it is true that he has broken the law. Whether he deserves punishment is a sort of different normative question that different people have different views on. The problem is there were four criminal cases against Trump. One of them was in Georgia, a RICO case involving Trump's bid to overturn Georgia's 2020 election results. One of them was a federal level case involving his attempts to subvert democracy circa 2020. One of them was a classified documents case in Florida. One of them was the New York hush money case involving Stormy Daniels. The only case that yielded convictions was the Stormy Daniels case. And unfortunately, it is by far the least compelling case against Trump. It is a largely technical case that doesn't have a very snazzy, particularly compelling, satisfying conclusion about Trump being a villain of democracy. And it's also a case where there's pretty reasonable arguments that the average person who commits similar offenses wouldn't get criminal level convictions. And the reason that's a problem is the Democrats have consistently claimed to be protecting democracy, but Trump persuasively framed Democrats as weaponizing the Department of Justice and the law enforcement system to go against Trump. And the one case that yielded convictions of Trump was the one that most Americans viewed as relatively unpersuasive with respect to Trump actually having broken the law. And now that Biden has pardoned Hunter Biden, kind of adds further credence to the claim that Democrats are awfully hypocritical when it comes to matters of democratic integrity. At least in the case of the Hunter Biden pardon, most Democrats, or at least a huge number of Democrats, have publicly come out against the pardon. Last reason the protecting democracy line didn't work particularly well. A decent number of voters outside of kind of like liberal media bubbles probably just view Democrats' obsession with defending existing status quo institutions as a broader defense of the status quo. And given that Trump framed himself as the anti-establishment and anti-elite candidate, the fact that Democrats were so focused on maintaining the status quo probably added fuel to the Republican fire. What about abortion rights? This one is much trickier because, and this is something that will probably get missed in a decent number of debates about the 2024 election and the Democrats more broadly, so it's a useful sort of factoid to keep in mind. Support for abortion rights is quite high in the United States relative to where it was even several years ago. Depending on what polls you look at, it's really tricky to get really good polling data. The numbers are probably around 60-40 nationwide in terms of supporting as opposed to opposing abortion rights, at least in the first and second trimesters. And the 2024 election actually supported this hypothesis because there are significant differences between how people voted at the presidential level and how they voted down the ballot. So, for example, around 10 states had proposals on their ballots for codifying constitutionally protections or prohibitions on abortion. And in seven, I forget the exact numbers, so you'll have to fact check me on this, but I think in seven out of those 10, eight if you would have included Florida, but Florida has an unusually high requirement of 60% voting. Those measures supported abortion rights and those ones passed. And what this indicates is something actually pretty interesting. Harris was not wrong to focus on abortion. There is broad support for abortion rights, and there is a broad consensus, even in relatively Republican states, that protecting abortion rights is good. So it's not that Harris lost the election because Americans are secretly more pro-life than Democrats had thought. Remember, part of the reason the Democrats so significantly outperformed in 2022 in the midterm elections, where many people had expected a right-wing Republican quote-unquote red wave, is because Democrats capitalized very effectively on the overturning of Roe v. Wade to gain political support in an election many people thought they were doomed in. So the reason Harris didn't win the election is not because Americans suddenly turned against abortion rights. It's more that one of two things is true. One of them is some number of Americans, it's unclear what percentage, we don't have great, or at least I haven't found great polling data on this yet. A decent number of Americans evidently believed Trump, that Trump will not, as president, ban nationwide abortion rights, that he wouldn't sign a nationwide abortion ban into law. It remains, well, I guess only time will tell whether or not this is actually true, but a reasonable plurality of voters seem to believe him. The second reason the Harris line on abortion rights didn't work is even though many people are pro-abortion, it's not clear that they were more pro-abortion than they were anti-inflation. And many voters probably were willing to make sacrifices, i.e., prioritizing economic concerns or immigration concerns over concerns with respect to reproductive rights. This is a little tricky because it requires you to sort of break down a lot of demographic data. So, for example, the fact that depending on which exit polls you look at, there's reasonable evidence that young women either stayed similar levels of support for the Democrats or shifted slightly to the right. There's some evidence that maybe part of the reason that happened is in part because even young women um, relative to 2020, we're more concerned about issues like migration slash inflation. What's much more important to note about all of this, though, is when I talked earlier about trends in Democratic and Republican politics, what we kept doing was comparing 2020 and 2016 to 2024. With the case of abortion, things are a little trickier, remember, because in 2020, Roe v. Wade was still the law of the land. So the fact that Harris did not gain ground with, for example, young women is actually more devastating than it might look like if you just looked at the breakdown demographically of voting in 2020 versus 2024. Because in theory, Harris should have significantly expanded her lead amongst demographics, like, for example, young women. The fact that she didn't is actually evidence that maybe in a different electoral cycle where, say, Roe never gets overturned, Trump would have performed even better amongst this demographic, which is further evidence that the Harris campaign struggled significantly to win on this issue. Okay, so that was the 2024 election. I have some notes that I sort of showed earlier about sort of what the Trump presidency will entail. I'll link them somewhere. The last thing we'll chat about, I lied, second to last thing we'll chat about is populism. We'll sort of focus more on the European case than on the Latin American case. We've just talked extensively about the American case, so I feel like that's adequately covered. But European populism has a tendency to come up in two types of debates. I guess three actually. One, some debates are just directly about the rise of populists. Second, there is a lot of debates about EU policy, EU economic agendas, and so forth. And populism is often central to those debates. And lastly, lots of debates about reforming electoral systems or changing the structure of the macroeconomy often have impacts about populism. So if you can think about why populism is good, why it's bad, why it's on the rise, why it might not be on the rise, all of this is pretty useful for tangible debate applications. So let's get cracking. Broad context, populism is on the rise, especially in Latin America and especially in Europe. In Italy, the Brothers of Italy, which are a far-right party under Giorgia Meloni, have gained significant ground compared to 2013 and even 2018. They got 9 votes in the Chamber of Deputies back really 11 years ago. Now it's up to nearly 120. In Germany, the AfD, the far-right, arguably neo-Nazi movement, or at least a movement that has been described as neo-Nazi, even by relatively centrist think tanks, is very much on the rise and has a real chance to gain significant ground in the upcoming Bundestag elections at the federal level. The Sweden Democrats, another far-right party, gaining substantial ground in, you guessed it, Sweden. If you look at the National Rally, formerly the National Front or Front National in France under Marie Le Pen, they've gained massive levels of support. If you, for example, look just at the July 2024 elections in France this summer, the National Rally was the best performing party and would have gained power were it not for some clever maneuvering by Macron and a center-right coalition that recently fell apart after the Barnier government passed through a budget through a sort of weird constitutional loophole that was highly unpopular and triggered both far left and far right votes of no confidence that resulted in the Barnier government collapsing. In Fidesz, you have a far right party that has governed Hungary for many years now under Viktor Orban. In Spain, the far-right Vox party has substantial influence in the Cortes General, although they did suffer a relatively decent beating in the 2023 Spanish elections in that summer. The FPO is a far-right party in Austria. They too have gained substantial ground. They are now the #1 largest party in Austria and have substantial influence in national politics. The point is that populism is very much on the rise, and it is therefore relevant to a significant number of debates about EU policy, about economic agendas, and so on. So the first thing I want to do is just clarify briefly what it means for a party to be populist, and then explore some of the reasons populism is on the rise, because that has a lot of important implications for how to contain the populist movements of the 21st century. So, what is a populist party? There's not a huge consensus on this, but there are broadly several characteristics that are typical of most populist movements. The typical characteristic of a populist platform is a differentiation between people and elites, i.e., populists make a big deal of being about the people, about direct democracy, about representing you, the real people, the silent majority. And populists usually frame the sort of pure people or the real people as being silenced and or repressed by some group of elites. Maybe it's corporations, maybe it's EU technocrats in Brussels, maybe it's cosmopolitans and the woke media elite, etc. The elite is often relatively amorphous. The left tends to identify the elite as being the capitalist elite, the global conspiratorial movement seeking to liberalize trade and globalize capital flows to extract surplus value from labor. The right also attacks those institutions like multinational corporations, but also often focuses on cultural or social elites that have substantial influence, for example, over Hollywood, over the media, and so forth. Outside of that, there are additional characteristics of populists that are perhaps more relevant for debate. So, one of them is that populists are often relatively personalistic, i.e., populist parties are often led by figureheads that have significant control over the party apparatus, and the party apparatus of the average populist party is usually weaker than the internal party structure of a non-populist or a mainstream centrist party. So, Trump is the clearest example of this. A clear cult of personality pervades Trump. He, in many ways, is the contemporary Republican Party. But similar stories were true, for example, of Alexis Tsipras of Syriza, also true of Viktor Orban of Fidesz. Of course, Tsipras and Syriza is a bit of a weird case because he did resign after the rather disastrous performance of Syriza, which is a far-left Greek party in the 2023 Greek elections. The second additional characteristic of populists that's useful for debate is that populists are often skeptical of classically liberal institutions. By liberal, I don't mean left-leaning, although that often can be true. I mean classically liberal in the sense of the rule of law and constraints on governing parties in democratic societies. So Law and Justice in Poland, or PIS, Peace, and Fidesz in Hungary have both been widely accused of undermining media independence and judicial protections, and both of them, both countries, Poland and Hungary, faced EU sanctions and reduced development assistance over those forms of democratic backsliding. Quick note, populism is not always right-wing. So Syriza in Greece and Podemos in Spain are both examples of left-wing populist movements. There are a variety of left-wing populist movements in Latin America. For example, many people would reasonably classify even Nicolas Maduro in Venezuela as a left-wing populist. There are also cases of populism not being particularly ideological or partisan. So the Five Star Movement in Italy, for instance, is a sort of catch-all political movement that is populist, but not necessarily left or right wing. It sort of transcends political boundaries. So that's what populism is, at least at the definitional level. Why is it on the rise? The easiest explanations that are usually thrown around in debate are somewhat inadequate. So the typical explanation is like populism is rising because people are dissatisfied with mainstream parties and or dissatisfied with a range of economic and or cultural problems. And this is fair, but the key question that you should always ask whenever you're debating about populism or debating about arguments related to populism is not just why is populism rising, but why is populism rising now? I.e., we've had democracy in many countries for literally centuries. What is so unique about this moment in time that populists are gaining such huge levels of support relative to 10, 20, 30, or 40 years ago? There are typically two-ish ways that you can explain this. I'm going to spend most of my time on the first, and we'll circle back to the second at the end. But the sort of first core explanation focuses on grievances of voters that are driving opposition to mainstream parties and increasing support for anti-establishment parties. Those typically tend to either be economic grievances following the financial crisis in 2008 or cultural grievances related to migration. I'll talk about both. And then the other basket of explanations for why populism is on the rise relate less to voters' grievances and instead focus more on changes in political messaging from populist parties. So I'll start by chatting about economic grievances and the interplay between economics and populist parties. So there are sort of broadly three-ish reasons you might say populist parties are rising, particularly in Europe now, as opposed to at any moment in the past. So the first and simplest reason is the 2008 financial crisis was a huge melting point in the global economic system. The crisis intensified or reached its highest peak in September 2008 with the collapse of Lehman Brothers shortly after midnight on September 15th, 2008. That subsequently spread across Europe due to tight financial linkages between American and European banks and subsequently precipitated the Eurozone debt crisis, in which a number of European countries, most famously Greece, either defaulted or came close to defaulting on sovereign debt. So here is Alexis Tsipras, who was the longtime prime minister of Greece between 2015 and 2019, as well as the leader of Syriza, the far left populist movement that came into power in the January 2015 elections in Greece. The problem is not just that Europe had a financial crisis. The problem is that Europe's recovery from the financial crisis has been grindingly slow. So this table doesn't give you a ton of information because it kind of is overwhelming, but it gives you the annualized GDP growth rates of EU member countries um, after the financial crisis. And although the numbers vary, the trend has been growth has been painful and growth has been slow. So if you look, for example, at unemployment rates across the Eurozone and across the European Union, adjusting for seasonal variations, the trend has been inflation is coming down. And it has, in fact, improved markedly even since the pandemic. But for many, many years, even after the Eurozone debt crisis largely dissipated, say circa 2015, unemployment rates remained pretty damn high. And that is troubling, given that unemployment, as I'll explore down the road, is tightly linked with increased support for right-wing populist movements, also left-wing populist movements as well. Youth unemployment in particular has been particularly high in Europe and remains a fairly large problem. Even if you just look over here post-pandemic, youth unemployment rates are still around 15% on average in the Euro area, which is relatively high compared to even other developed countries, even the United States. If you look at some countries that were hit really bad by the crisis, the story is even worse. So this here is inflation adjusted GDP for Greece by year. And what you'll notice is Greece, even now in 2024, its inflation adjusted GDP is still markedly lower than what it was prior to the financial crisis. So Greece hasn't just suffered from the financial crisis. Greece has literally not even recovered from the crisis. And if its current growth trajectories hold, it's going to take decades before Greece reaches a point where it's as rich as it was in, say, 2006, 2007. So the key question you might ask is like, and it's an excellent question, is why has Europe recovered so slowly from the financial crisis? There are a lot of explanations. There are entire books written on this. I'm just going to summarize a couple of the perhaps most plausible explanations for why the Eurozone as a whole and the EU as a bloc have recovered slowly. The simplest explanation comes from Mario Draghi, who is the former European central banker, former prime minister in Italy during the pandemic, and was recently appointed by the EU to write a report on EU competitiveness and EU integration moving forward. And Draghi's summary is that Europe, part of the reason at least why Europe has persistently slow growth rates in the last 15-ish years is that Europe's economy is restricted by an overly complex and needlessly bureaucratic regulatory apparatus. And the extensive regulation of the European commercial system has a series of harmful implications for Europe's growth prospects. For starters, large numbers of innovative companies either never get set up in Europe or they move to the United States because that's where regulatory compliance costs are much lower. And as a consequence, productive, innovative startups don't get built in Europe. They get built either in China or in the United States. In addition to that, though, the additional reason why extensive regulation is harmful is it means that it is significantly harder for entrepreneurs to actually build productive, innovative ideas into productive, innovative businesses. So, for example, access to venture capital, as I'll explore in just a moment, is significantly reduced in the European Union compared to in the United States. So, even when talent exists in the EU, that talent is often stifled by regulatory institutions in a way that prevents Europe from rebounding adequately from the crisis. Two examples. One example is Europe and the EU as a bloc has fairly generous employment protection measures, which either reduce and or deter and or disincentivize, excuse me, corporations from firing workers even during crises, for example, increasing severance pay or increasing the time that employers have to give before laying off employees. And part of the problem with this, there's a sort of somewhat now famous 2003 paper that sort of explores the theoretical foundations of EPL and what potential implications that has for labor markets. One of the major potential problems with employment security provisions in EU law is that it means that countries recover very slowly from economic crises. It's not hard to envision why companies are less likely to take on new workers because they know that the potential long-term costs of doing so are higher, which means that it takes much longer for um, unemployment rates to rebound post-crisis. The other example for where Europe lags behind other countries is venture capital. The reason venture capital is important is not because you should needlessly fetishize capitalism, it's because venture capital is often an important source of funding for startups, given that startups have a difficult time acquiring loans from banks given their lack of borrowing history. The problem is that venture capital firms are significantly undercapitalized in Europe relative to the US. This data is from 2014, but still the broad empirics hold to this day. And even returns on venture capital investments are significantly higher in the United States, which is here in this lighter blue, compared to Europe, which is in this darker blue. All of which means that Europe faces significant constraints on companies' abilities to grow and companies' ability to innovate. The second potential reason Europe has had such stagnant growth rates is just that globalization has failed Europe, and the extensive economic integration that's accompanied the European Union has perhaps not resulted in the adequate levels of growth that many Europeans want. One potential explanation for why that is that the European Union has witnessed large-scale deindustrialization, i.e., factories closing down and moving overseas in the age of free trade and the age of liberalization. I talked about this a bit more last week. Across the EU, that is a bit suspicious because a decent amount of manufacturing within Europe is still done within Europe. It's just now done in countries, say, in Eastern Europe. But if you look at specific countries, say Germany, Italy, France, for instance, the relative importance of manufacturing as a percentage of GDP or as a percentage of value added GDP has declined markedly. And of course, the problem, as we discussed earlier in the previous lecture, is deindustrialization and the distributional inequalities created by globalization create concentrated political movements against further integration, i.e., if you have 5% of a population lose its job and 20% of a population benefit from cheaper prices, the group that loses their job is much more outraged than the group that benefits from cheaper prices, and that precipitates significant anger at EU integration and, in many instances, results in backlash against the EU, often taking the form of voting for anti-establishment populists. The additional implication of globalization beyond deindustrialization, i.e., a closure of factory work and industrial output, is that the relative importance of labor to the European economy across the EU has shrank as a percentage of GDP, which means that even though European economies have grown since the crisis on aggregate, the extent to which workers' wages have kept pace with rising costs of living has largely not materialized. The last and related explanation pertains to inflation. This is largely an explanation that's kicked in kind of since COVID, but especially since the war in Ukraine began on February 24th, 2022. The short explanation is that inflation has been a major problem in Europe recently of late, and just as inflation was terrible for Harris, inflation too has been terrible for center-left and center-right parties in Europe. And part of the reason why inflation has been particularly bad in Europe is because in many European countries, inflation has outpaced wage growth. At least in the United States, empirically, wages have either kept pace or slightly out increased, so to speak, inflation. So if you look at Germany, for example, inflation hit particularly high levels in 22 and 23. If you look at France, a similar story applies. Similar deal in the Netherlands here in 2022 and 23. You can really see that spike in energy and commodities prices. Similar story in Greece. And even worse, many independent analysts, I forget where this particular one is from, but it's reasonably well sourced. There are many analysts that expect energy prices to remain significantly higher in the EU compared to in countries like the United States or China, which means that the problem of inflation is unlikely to be a problem that dissipates in the near-ish term future. So for example, wholesale electricity prices will probably be somewhere in the ballpark of 2 to 2.5 times more expensive in Europe in 2030 comparing to the United States, probably about double what they will be in China. Why does globalization, deindustrialization, inflation, etc., impact populists? The first and simply most obvious answer is there is a reasonably strong statistical correlation between loss of income and increased support for anti-establishment parties. And it's not hard to see why. If you are deeply dissatisfied with the state of the economy, if you do not feel like mainstream parties represent your views and you do not feel heard, you are much more likely to vote for the party that has a convenient basket of answers. Even if their policy proposals are shallow, they don't have tangible proposals for making inflation better, you might be willing to engage in protest voting, i.e., voting against the establishment incumbent party to signal your dissatisfaction. But there are also more causal explanations for why decreasing income or increasing inflation precipitates support for populism. One explanation is, and this is something, by the way, that you can deploy pretty nicely in lots of debates, is when it's like I guess the way I'll put it is this. Inflation and recession is not new to politics. There have been inflationary crises and recessionary crises in Europe for decades after the Second World War, and yet the rise of populism is relatively newer. So it's not just enough to say, well, there are economic problems in Europe, therefore there's populism. Because the key question is, okay, if there's a center-right party in power and inflation rises, why wouldn't voters do the natural thing, which is shift to the center left, i.e., if the Christian Democratic Union is in power in Germany and you dislike what the Christian Democratic Union has done with respect to inflation, why wouldn't you just vote for, say, the Social Democrats or the Liberals? And part of the reason why is many voters believe, reasonably, I might add, that there is a neoliberal consensus, or there has been a neoliberal consensus between centrist parties on the center left and on the center right, i.e., for decades, both center left and center right parties jointly stood behind policies like privatization of state-owned enterprises, removal of price caps, the liberalization of barriers to trade. And the consequence is that many voters view the centrist political faction of the political spectrum as functionally identical. And if you don't think the center left is that different from the center right or vice versa, then you might be more willing to vote for an anti-establishment party that advocates for systemic revolutionary change if you don't think that mainstream incrementalist parties will ever get the job done. The other reason why, and this is something we'll explore in just a moment when we chat about immigration, is the increasing levels of economic insecurity in many countries has a significant linkage with backlash against immigration because many people associate rising levels of inflation or rising levels of unemployment with associated problems that arise from high levels of immigration. And whether or not that's empirically true is arguably irrelevant because right-wing populists have convinced a significant number of voters that there is a causal relationship between their economic suffering and increased inflows of immigrants. And given that the far right campaigns very explicitly on an anti-immigrant platform, it shouldn't be surprising to you that as high levels of immigration have coincided with high levels of economic insecurity, right-wing populists link those two claims together and enjoy substantial electoral success as a result. That brings us nicely to cultural grievances driving support for immigration. Context: the Syrian civil war began in 2011, and as I'll address in a moment, is now restarting as we speak. And in 2015, the European Union experienced a significant influx of refugees and asylum seekers, many of them from Syria, but not all of them from Syria. For example, a decent number of people also fled Libya after the 2011 NATO intervention. A decent number of people also fled Afghanistan as fighting between the Taliban/insurgency and the US-backed regime in Kabul intensified. The point is that there were well over 1 million asylum applications in Europe, in continental Europe, at least in 2015. Subsequently, these application numbers have also surged post-pandemic. You might remember that in the midst of the Syrian refugee crisis, the EU inked a fairly substantial deal with Turkey, in which Turkey increased its acceptance of Syrian refugees as a mechanism to reduce asylum seeker inflows into the European Union as a response to the political backlash against migration that followed the Syrian refugee crisis. Now, the number of asylum seekers is again rising and has risen steadily since the relaxing of immigration controls post-COVID. It's worth noting that this problem of migration flows will probably intensify if the sort of reignition of the Syrian civil war continues, as it has appeared to begun to intensify in recent days. Why does the rise of migration into Europe matter with respect to populism? The simple answer is that there is increasing opposition to migration in the European Union. So, for example, if you look at data even prior to the 2015 migration crisis, you can see that broadly, a large number of voters between roughly 2011, the beginning of Arab Spring, and 2015, which is when the polling data ends here, a large number of voters increasingly began to become concerned about immigration. And part of that, of course, is associated with increasing numbers of asylum seekers and increasing numbers of refugees, but also increasing numbers of economic migrants. A good example of this that people often might forget about because it happened so long ago, much of the anti-immigrant rhetoric in the lead up to the Brexit referendum actually wasn't focused on, say, Arab migrants from Muslim majority countries. Much of the rhetoric was focused on Eastern European migrants into the into the United Kingdom after the EU expansion in the early 2000s. But perhaps the best example of the backlash against immigration is Germany, where the number of asylum seekers granted entry into Germany peaked dramatically under Angela Merkel and the Christian Democratic Union in 2015 and 2016, in which the total number of asylum seekers settled in Germany rose to nearly 1 million. And the response was swift and the response was devastating. The percentage of German voters who thought that Germany was accepting too many migrants rose pretty sharply from roughly 40-ish% to well over 60% in just basically under 6 months. And that's strong evidence that the sudden influx of migrants had a negative effect on views on immigration in Germany. This is also true elsewhere. So even in Britain, where obviously Britain left the European Union circa June 2016 at the referendum and officially exited in 2021, a significant number of British voters still hold the belief that Britain should reduce its acceptance of migrants, which suggests again a high level of opposition to immigration across the European Union. So that's the empirics, and if you look at polling data on many countries, you'll get similar results. But this doesn't answer the underlying question, which is why does anti-immigration backlash associated with the influx of migrants actually reduce support for mainstream parties and increase support for populists? The first reason is that many populists have successfully portrayed the European Union and the EU's policies on migration as anti-democratic, i.e., many populists have convinced voters, and they're actually kind of right on this as a matter of empirics, that individual EU members have limited control over their external migration policy for the very simple reason that this is governed by international law and European courts. Consequently, right-wing populists have fused Eurosceptic attitudes towards the EU with anti-immigrant sentiment to convince voters that their frustrations with immigration are linked to right-wing populist arguments against further EU integration. The second reason that anti-immigrant backlash increases support for populists is many populists champion what's called welfare chauvinism, which is the belief that national governments ought to restrict access to welfare benefits for foreign-born residents, i.e., asylum seekers, immigrants, economic migrants, and so forth. The problem is that this is illegal under EU law, which again means that European populists have a very powerful political claim to say that we should reduce welfare benefits for migrants. The fact that we cannot do so is evidence of a technocratic expansion of undemocratic EU authority, and this lends further credence to the far-right populist cause. Note, welfare chauvinism and advocacy for welfare chauvinism was one of the main factors precipitating the Brexit referendum in 2016. Thirdly, a significant number of far-right voters and far-right parties frame immigration, especially from Muslim majority countries, as a threat to traditional European values. It's worth noting that this is not exclusively an argument made by racist right-wing politicians. This is also increasingly an argument made by left-wing populists who frame especially Muslim men entering Europe as a threat to progressive social values like respect for gay rights and respect for feminism. This is also an argument made on the right wing, as I'll discuss in a moment. But for example, if you look at the rhetoric used by the Sweden Democrats in Sweden, much of their rhetoric frames Muslim immigrants as a threat to Swedish women, who may, for example, according to the far right, face increased threats of sexual violence. The last reason that there's a relationship between anti-immigrant backlash and populist support is what I'll sort of crudely call the double effect of Islamophobia, which is there are many people in Europe who dislike Muslims. This is not a contentious claim, it's well backed by data. But what's interesting is that this is not necessarily restricted to one end of the political spectrum. Many conservatives who are on average more religious often dislike Muslims in part because of their differing religious beliefs. But interestingly, many leftists who are on average slightly more atheist or slightly more agnostic also tend to dislike Muslims, but sometimes for a different reason. For example, it's because they actually dislike the religiosity of Muslims, and empirically, the average Muslim immigrant into the EU is more religious than the average native-born European with respect to a religion like, say, Protestant Christianity or Catholicism. One of the kind of most popular depictions of the sort of anti-immigrant argument was published back in 2017 by Douglas Murray, a controversial author. The book is called The Strange Death of Europe. And its opening is it pretty much gives you the summary of the book in four sentences, which is, and the language is bold, but it gives you a sense for how the sort of anti-immigrant right views itself and what it's defending is, quote, Europe is committing suicide. The argument that is made by Murray and by most right-wing populists is that Europe faces an invasion of foreign immigrants and Europe must seal its borders or restrict immigration flows to protect European values. And that argument has a lot of racist undertones, but the argument has found substantial levels of political support, not just among far-right voters, but also among voters who are worried by or opposed to the influx of immigrants. Part of the reason, I guess I'm actually going to skip this, and I'll come back to that in a second. Part of the reason that this becomes theoretically complicated in debate is that there are two arguments that are often made about immigrants within debate rounds. One argument that's made is if we increase the number of immigrants we accept into a country, we should expect to see hostility towards immigrants go down due to contact theory, i.e., positive social interactions between, say, white Europeans and foreign-born, say, Syrian refugees will gradually break down stereotypes. This conflicts with what is conceptually called group threat theory, that posits that contact between, say, white Europeans and minorities, say, immigrants, will actually intensify stereotypes, partially because there's an informational cognitive selection bias, i.e., if you are racist, then you subconsciously select for information in your day-to-day interactions that validates your racist preconceptions, but also because if you are a majority group and you come into greater contact with a minority and you believe, for example, that immigrants are going to repopulate Europe with non-European values, then you might be more likely to view, say, immigrants as a threat to your well-being. So the key question that you should ask to resolve this clash in debate, i.e., which effect is greater, contact theory increasing support for immigration or group threat theory decreasing support for immigration, the sort of deadlock breaker that explains which of these two effect sizes is greater is the nature of social contact. And what I mean by that is if the type of contact between native-born populations and foreign-born immigrants is largely uh, insubstantial or relatively meaningless, for example, if the only interactions you have with people are on the subway or at a grocery store or in passing, then there's a reasonable probability that group threat theory will outweigh contact theory, i.e., because you don't get the benefits of real conversations and real relationships with immigrants, you are less likely to get the benefits of immigration, socially speaking, and you are more likely to entrench stereotypes. If, by contrast, the type of interaction between immigrants and native-born residents is positive, i.e., you have real discussions, real relationships, real interactions, you're more likely to break down stereotypes and more likely to break down prejudices because you have that positive contact that breaks down the perceived threat posed by immigrants. One question that you might have that I want to quickly just address before moving on to our sort of like last basket of topics with respect to selectorate theory is if right-wing populists are so popular for championing restrictions on immigration, why does Europe keep accepting immigrants? And I don't mean this in a racist way. I just mean it in a strictly practical way. Part of it is law, i.e., the EU has international law obligations to, for example, ensure fair treatment of asylum seekers. But part of it is also economics. So remember that European countries on average spend somewhere like 40% of their fiscal budgets on social programs like welfare, healthcare, etc., significantly more than a country like, say, the United States. The problem is that European countries face a significant demographic crisis, i.e., they are aging dramatically. Part of the reason countries need to accept migrants is because the demographic structure of immigration populations are significantly different than the demographic structure of native-born populations. So here, for example, what you'll see is that foreign-born populations, i.e., non-nationals, which are in blue, are significantly younger and also have higher fertility rates than domestic native-born populations, i.e., national citizens who were born in the country. That's important because as the national population ages, you need lots of additional workers to fill labor shortages, especially in fields like healthcare, for example, or elder care, which is part of the reason why even after Brexit, immigration inflows into the UK actually increased pretty significantly post-Brexit because of the economic need, for example, for additional workers in the National Health Service. So this is an interesting example of where there's a tension between the cultural backlash against immigration and the very real economic need for continued inflows of immigrants to fill crucial shortages in the economy. And obviously, this is a very dehumanizing way to talk about immigration that sort of denies agency and perspective to individual migrants. So I don't mean this in a way that is intended to sort of demean slash undermine the migrant experience, and more to say from the perspective of, say, a government in Europe dealing with the populist crisis, this is why you don't have any good answers. If you just mass restrict border crossings, you are violating EU law, likely to face EU sanctions, and plausibly will harm your own economy now and into the future. If you cave into the far right's demands and restrict immigration, very real chance that you face those harms. If you continue to support large-scale migration, you probably fuel support for the populist right. Last thing I'll just kind of quickly address with respect to contact theory and group threat theory is the relationship between social contact and attitudes is complicated. There's a bit of a curved relationship here. So what this graph represents is countries where there's a relatively greater percentage of residents who are practicing Muslims, and on the y-axis represents reported levels of anti-Muslim attitudes. And what you'll notice is that the most anti-Muslim or the most Islamophobic countries are, on average, countries with the fewest Muslims, i.e., the less of a population of minorities you have, the easier it is to hate them. That being said, the relationship outside of this very, very small portion of countries is not very clear. And most of these countries are Eastern European countries where the level of hostility towards Muslim immigrants is significantly higher. The relationship outside of that is a bit complicated. So, for example, if you think about a country like Spain and compare it to a country like Bulgaria, Bulgaria has significantly more Muslims as a percentage of population, but overall attitudes towards Muslims appear to be relatively similar. So the relationship is not nearly as clear-cut as you might imagine, or as clear-cut as social contact theory would imagine. Last thing on populism, and then we'll chat about how to be a dictator, supply side explanations. There's three important ways in which the populist right wing has restructured itself in the last 15 years that are often not acknowledged in debate rounds about populism. So these are all useful to keep in mind. The first important shift is that most far right parties, particularly in Europe, are no longer as radical as they once were. Simplest example of this is the National Rally, or the Front National in France, where the National Rally of Jean-Marie Le Pen, who was the previous leader of the party, compared to the party under Marie Le Pen, the shift has been stratospheric. Jean-Marie Le Pen was in many ways explicitly a Holocaust denier. Marie Le Pen is significantly more moderate and has gone to tremendous lengths to appeal towards demographics like gay voters, like Jewish voters, like non-white voters, and there's a significant transformation of the party between those two generations of leadership. Similarly, many Italian far-right parties, Brothers of Italy, for example, have significantly, or Lega, which came beforehand, have significantly rebranded their images to explicitly move away from fascism or neo-fascism and the sort of relationship those parties have historically had with Mussolini sympathizers. So that's the first important way that the far right has changed, which is it's shifted the way it presents itself as explicitly reasonable. Although these parties will publicly say that they don't care about what they're labeled, they do very much care about not being labeled things like racist or xenophobic because they very much want to be mainstream. They want to be popular. The second way that far-right parties have changed in a particularly important way is that many far-right parties are now explicitly left-wing on economic issues. So many right-wing populists, the reason that we call them right-wing populists is because they satisfy the populist characteristics outlined previously, and they're right-wing on immigration, but they're often quite left-wing on economic issues, especially the welfare state. And this is devastatingly harmful for center-left parties like social democratic parties or labor parties. And the reason it's devastating is because center-left parties have historically been parties of the working class. The problem is when the far right appeals to working class economic agendas like expanding the welfare state and couples leftist economic proposals with conservative views on immigration, this is a very appealing message in many instances for working class voters who do have concerns about immigration and the potential economic consequences that will follow. The consequence is that many center left parties are now in a very ugly bind because they have to make a difficult decision. If you maintain center left on immigration, you are likely to lose support to far right parties. If you shift to the right on immigration, you're likely to alienate your center left or leftist base. So center left parties have no good option when it comes to responding to the rise of far right populists. And it's very difficult to figure out how center left parties will plausibly restructure their own agendas in response to the populist challenge. Last way the far right has rebranded itself is mostly not true in Eastern Europe. This is mostly only true in Western Europe, but many Western European far right parties, France, Germany, Sweden, Netherlands, etc., now explicitly frame their anti-immigrant advocacy through a socially progressive lens with respect to gender and sexuality. So, for example, one of the most common arguments that you'll hear made against Muslim migration is that Muslim immigrants do not support, for example, gay marriage or do not support women's rights. And therefore, we need to protect women and gay communities by restricting immigration. And empirically, this messaging does appear to work. So if you look, for example, at exit polls from the July 2024 election in France, either it depends a bit on which exit polls you look at, but either a majority of or near majority of self-identified gay voters in France actually voted for the far right, which is reasonably strong evidence that this type of strategy has worked reasonably well. Last thing, and then we're going to wrap up. I guess this will run a little bit over from what I was intending, but I think that we will have some fun. Selectorate theory. So this comes, well, it doesn't come from, the theory has been developed outside of this book, but this is probably the most popular rendition of it. And if you haven't read The Dictator's Handbook, I'd strongly recommend. It's a great book. It's a lot of fun. It's very digestible to a non-technical audience. But the kind of core argument I want to develop from the book is what they sort of call selectorate theory. And the idea of selectorate theory is that different groupings of people play different roles in selecting who has power. And there are basically three groups of people in society that have some role in influencing or determining who has power. So the kind of core idea is on the outskirts you have, and there are different names, and what exactly you call them doesn't matter. What matters is the concept. On the outskirts, you have the notional or the nominal selectorate. These are the people who, in theory, have the power to make decisions about who has power and who doesn't, but in practice have very little direct influence or their individual level of power is limited. So in a democracy, for example, the people who theoretically have power would be all of the voters that have theoretically the right to vote. They theoretically get to control who wins the election. But in practice, they don't because they're an individual voter and their individual vote will almost never swing the election. On the inner circle, you start to have more important factions in the selectorate. And the second most important sort of subset of electors are the actual people who make the decision about who gets power. So, for example, in a democratic election, that might be swing voters whose votes actually determine who wins the election. So, swing states in the United States. But more realistically, in the United States context, it might be the Electoral College, for instance, the people who actually cast the final votes that determine who wins the presidency. In a communist country, say China, well, it's not a communist country, but a politically communist country, the Selectorate would be the actual Politburo within the CCP, the body that actually determines who the premier leader in China is and who the paramount official at the top of the PRC happens to be. The most important subset, though, of the Selectorate, in other words, the group of people who select leaders, is what's called the winning coalition, or the essential selectors. And these are the people within that secondary bucket, that most important basket of selectors, i.e., the Electoral College or the Politburo of the CCP. The winning coalition is the subset of selectors who wield ultimate authority or have the greatest influence over how other selectors make decisions. So, for example, in China, there is a seven-person organization called the Standing Committee of the CCP. And the Standing Committee is the most important group of people in China because they have significant influence over who is given power in China, who and which provinces receive money, and so on and so forth. In a military autocracy, the winning coalition is often business oligarchs and security officials. So, for example, the people who have ultimate authority over determining who is leading the country are people like military generals and business billionaires. So, in Russia, an example I'll explore in a moment, you could probably say that major military officials in the Kremlin, as well as business oligarchs, are the winning coalition. So, Selectorate theory basically says that there are those three groups of people who have some influence in determining who has power. You have the notional selectorate, the nominal selectorate, which in theory has power on paper, but in practice doesn't really. Then you have people who have notionally the direct control over who gets power, and they do matter, but they are less important than the winning coalition, the essentials, who are really the ones with control because they influence how those with selection capacity exercise their selection capacity. The core argument from selectorate theory then is that politics at its core is about acquiring and maintaining power, and everything that politicians do is instrumentally valuable in pursuit of the maintenance of power. What does that mean? Politicians are ultimately not interested in the well-being of the country and the maintenance of an ideology, in the promotion of nationalism, or in doing what is best for others. Politicians in democratic and in authoritarian countries share identical goals. They are using ideology and nationalism and welfare benefits and public policy as instruments to maintain their grasp on power. The key question then is, how do you as a politician use resources, for example, tax revenue, to determine which groups of people you should try to win over? In other words, if you're a politician, how do you maintain power? How do you ensure that people support your rule? Now, given the selectorate structure of politics, again, a little bit abstract, but the theory is pretty useful in practice. The core argument from selectorate theory is that politicians maintain power by winning the allegiance and loyalty of the winning coalition, i.e., the most powerful selectors. For example, oligarchs, security officials, major corporations. How do you win the support and the loyalty and the allegiance of that winning coalition? You typically do so through two types of mechanisms. The first is the provision of direct economic and political influence. So, for example, in most authoritarian regimes, the way that the major dictator stays in power is by awarding cronies with positions, for example, running state-owned enterprises, running military divisions, or having cushy access to government coffers. The second way that you maintain power is by threatening to revoke economic and political privileges from people in the winning coalition if they move away from loyalty. So, in other words, if you're a dictator, you don't just give out cash and give out political power willy-nilly. You add conditions. You make it clear that you are happy, for example, to jail or to imprison or to even assassinate a powerful oligarch or a powerful military general who steps out of line, who opposes you or is rumored to oppose you. And so, what's very important about selectorate theory, and this is the part that's actually relevant to debate that is often missed, is the way that authoritarian regimes maintain power is not only by providing benefits to important constituencies like the military or oligarchs, it is also by making sure that the number of people they depend on for support is low enough that they do not need a huge base of public support, but also making sure that they do not rely solely on one or two individuals or institutions, because then they are no longer the real dictator. They are now beholden to some other actor. For example, they're beholden to the military general, or they're beholden to the CEO of the largest corporation in the country. And so selectorate theory obligates political actors and authoritarian regimes to balance between the need for diffusing of power and at the same time, reducing the number of people in that winning coalition. The idea is the smaller the size of the winning coalition, so the fewer oligarchs, for example, whose support is essential, or the fewer military generals whose support is essential, then you are better able to maintain power because you can concentrate your resources on those groups. But you also need to make sure that the size of that winning coalition is sufficiently large that you can threaten to replace and to remove individuals. So a kind of interesting example is Vladimir Putin is a kind of paramount example of a dictator. Like he is a highly personalist regime in the Kremlin. Power is centered around Putin. How does Putin maintain power? Part of it is by extracting wealth from Russia's oil industry, oil and gas industry, countries like Lukoil, Rosneft, Gazprom, etc., and then redistributing those gains partially to citizens in Russia to prevent a risk of revolt, but more importantly to powerful elites in the Russian security apparatus and in the oligarchy. What's important, though, is Putin also maintains power through directly punishing and removing from power those who are disloyal to the Kremlin. So the kind of canonical example of this is all of the oligarchs who fall out of a 37-story tall building from their window, i.e., they're killed by the Kremlin for speaking out against Putin or for allegedly moving against the Kremlin's interest. The other way that Putin does this, though, and this is something that lots of people have been trying to figure out, and I think that this is the best explanation for, Putin also encourages, in many ways, individual agents within the Kremlin to constantly be at each other's throats. And what I mean by that is Putin requires loyalty to him, but is comfortable with individual oligarchs and security officials having beef with each other. So a kind of interesting example of this, Russia has a very, very active military blogger community. They're called mil bloggers, and they publish daily, often hourly posts about the war in Ukraine. And what's very interesting about Russian mil bloggers is they are some of the best sources of information, counterintuitively, on the war in Ukraine, because they are fiercely critical of many Russian generals. And lots of people have been confused by this. Like, why is it that Putin allows often government paid military bloggers to criticize what Shoigu or Gerasimov are doing in Ukraine? And the answer that is supported by selectorate theory is by constantly ensuring that different security officials are at each other's throats, Putin reduces the risk of broad solidarity within the Russian military, which could potentially precipitate a coup. By reminding each individual general that they depend solely on Putin and Putin alone for power, and that they are always at risk of being replaced, you create a combination of both carrots and sticks that keeps people loyal to you. This is often very useful analysis to provide in debates about authoritarian regimes or debates about how authoritarian regimes maintain power. It is not true that the average authoritarian regime is concerned about a revolution by the people. What the average authoritarian regime is concerned about is losing the support of that winning coalition, that core essential constituency within the electorate. That is the group of people, the military, the oligarchy, etc., whose support you absolutely require. And hence, if you lose the support of those groups, if you lose their loyalty, you probably lose power in turn. So that's a very brief and very rushed intro to selectorate theory, but hopefully this was a kind of interesting case study in this. Okay, bye, internet.